got a chance! Grand slam! The Yankees win! And a touchdown! He goes to the net! He scores! He scores! Home run! Number 3 of the night!
So the Cuban Babe Ruth came to town this weekend as we witnessed the Chicago White Sox play the Chicago Cubs at Wrigley Field, and the Cuban Babe Ruth I'm speaking of is Jose Abreu. The guy hit 6 home runs over the weekend. And guys, I just wanted to welcome everybody to the show. A huge weekend for Jose Abreu. The White Sox destroyed the Cubs. I almost thought about starting off this episode with a broom, but the Cubs took Game 3 over the weekend. And it was a huge pivotal series for White Sox fans because they came out of the woodworks. I mean, I haven't heard from some of these people in years. And they're coming out saying, whoa, did you see us? We beat you guys finally. Well, it's about time. But anyway, guys, welcome to the show. We have a huge basketball episode coming up. We do need to touch Cubs Sox. But other than that, we're in good shape. We're going to be talking a lot of basketball. We have a football one coming up in 2 weeks. But this whole episode is going to be dedicated to basketball outside of baseball.
We're going to talk about Abreu a lot in this episode. It's like bringing back round 2 of the Cuban Missile Crisis with 6 home runs in 3 days. He was absolutely fantastic. And even before that series, though, the White Sox have really picked it up. They won 7 in a row before finally losing the last game of the series on Sunday. So that they are finally starting to get that team chemistry that they haven't had the first month or so of the season. And they are really, really starting to get dangerous. So they're a team to watch out for.
Yeah, for sure. The White Sox, they really proved it over the weekend. They got great production from their lineup, their power hitters, especially Jose Abreu. The guy had 9 RBIs in the series, I believe, and he had 15 RBIs that week. The Cubs' leading RBI guy has 15 on the season, and it's a combo of David Bodie and Ian Happ. And Bodie, I mean, he's only playing every day because Chris Bryant, you know how I feel about him, hasn't been able to play every single day. So he's been getting the at-bats, and he's been making the most of it. I mean, he is only hitting about 210, but he is a clutch hitter. That's how he is. So he drives in runners that are on base, and he does a good job at doing that. He's one of the best clutch hitters on the team. And the trade deadline's coming up this week. Do you guys see the Cubs making any moves at getting anybody? I know their financial space is a little bit dim at the moment, but do you guys see any potential people coming over to the north side?
If it's any indicator what Theo did in the offseason, I think we'll be the Cubs, that is, pretty quiet. We got the players, it seems, Javier Baez, Anthony Rizzo, even Wilson Contreras, even though they're having down years, they can flip a switch and play well and hit the ball well. We have a pretty good defense, I'd say. So to go after somebody, I think we do need a bullpen arm. Dylan hit on it last episode because we have one lefty in the bullpen, Kyle Ryan, with a ERA skyrocketed to 9. So I think if the Cubs will be okay if they can maintain 500 ball or even a little bit over 500 the rest of the year, since they did build a cushion in the first 16 games.
Cubs are unlikely to make any big moves. I do think they should be aggressive, but I agree that I think they're a little bit more likely to maybe make 1 or 2 smaller moves to try to address the bullpen, similar to what the Phillies did with their trade with the Red Sox the other day, going for Hembree and Workman. I could see the Cubs making a move like that. The financial ramifications of everything going on right now make trades in general a lot more difficult. So I don't see any blockbusters coming up from them, but I do think they have a clear weak spot on the roster. But the other reason I think that they are going to be relatively passive is because they have a lot of cushion in their division right now. So the odds of them missing the playoffs entirely are almost 0. And while I do think that might give them a false sense of security, I also think it's a good reason not to mortgage the entire farm system or give away too much for a minor upgrade.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, from the south side part of things with the White Sox, do you see them making a move? We saw Dylan Cease come out and pitch. I mean, he carved up the Cubs offense for 4 innings like a Thanksgiving turkey. I mean, he was going up and down that lineup, throwing his great breaking stuff that we saw in the Midwest League that allowed him to be the Midwest League Pitcher of the Year with a 10-2 record, I believe. Maybe it was 12-2 for the South Bend Cubs. And that's a guy that we always knew was going to be a great pitcher in the bigs, and he proved it against the Cubs. It was really good to see that. Being a Cubs fan, having him, even if it's against us, still have that success in the big leagues, because that's what you hope to see out of all these players that they develop. And that's a pitcher that the Cubs could have had, but we're not going to bring that up because you all know what happened there. So with the White Sox, do you see them making any trades, either to bolster that lineup even more or even get some more pitching? What do you guys think?
Well, what Swig said about the Cubs, I kind of agree with the White Sox. I don't see any blockbuster moves happening. Their rotation could use some work outside of Giolito, and Dylan just hit on Dylan Cease. Dylan Cease is a fireball arm. He has a little ways to go. He is good, but that rotation needs to improve, and they will start winning ball games. They remind me of the 2015 Cubs, not going to lie. They're young, and I just don't see the upper management making any moves just yet, just because they're a year or two away. And I think if they keep all their pieces and keep their cash, they'll be good in the next few years, like me and Swig think.
The White Sox need to be really, really careful, in my opinion. We've seen this before, where a talented team that isn't complete yet mortgages their future for a quick fix. And I think that could have catastrophic consequences for the White Sox if they're not careful. If they give up too much for maybe a Trevor Bauer type of arm at the deadline here, I don't think it's going to put them over the top this year, and it's definitely going to have a somewhat negative impact on them going forward. So while I do think the White Sox should be aggressive when they're clearly more realistic contenders, hopefully in the next 2 to 3 years at the most, for now, I think they need to be smart and patient and not mortgage any of their young core to try to win an extra game or two in a 60-game season. It's just not worth it.
I do agree with you, but I'm going to throw a little twist out there. The White Sox haven't made the playoffs in 12 years. And we've already seen Rick Hahn be aggressive at times during his tenure with the White Sox. In 2015, you saw him go all in to win. He traded for Jeff Samardzija. He made these big signings. He went after Todd Frazier, I believe. And he actually traded Frankie Montas, who's actually having a great season with the Oakland A's. And he's been a great pitcher. But you've seen Rick Hahn be aggressive, and I'm with you saying that if he does, it could mortgage the future of that team. As long as he doesn't trade anyone like a Nick Madrigal or any of these young players, or maybe even Dane Dunning, that could be a big catastrophic damage as well. So you don't want to trade anyone big, but if they could get someone to just plug in to maybe get them to the postseason, it'll be very helpful for that organization.
Yeah, no, I do think that we definitely know Rick Hahn's reputation of being a little bit over aggressive, and that's why I think they need to be extra cautious here. We've seen that plan backfire if a team is too aggressive too fast. I definitely respect where his head is at, and the White Sox do have a lot more talent on that roster right now than they have had since the mid to late 2000s. It's just been for most of the last 100 years, they've pretty much sucked outside of 2005. So I understand the impulse for impatience, but any diehard or true fan of a team like that struggled for most of their history would rather put up with 1 or 2 more years of mediocrity for an established contender for several years down the road. I guarantee it. Now, if the White Sox had a way to guarantee winning a championship by being over aggressive, then it's a different conversation. But that is just not the market that the White Sox are in right now. So I would be very worried that Hahn is going to be over aggressive too quickly.
Yeah, and Jonah actually mentioned the 2015 Chicago Cubs. I actually want to do a different comparison here because they have a very similar pitcher on that staff that was on this young team. The Astros a few years back, I mean, they were awful. From the NL Central going over to the AL West, they were horrible. They had 100 lost seasons in consecutive years, and they were not good at all. But like Swig said, then they started to establish that core. They didn't go too hard when they finally had the pieces. They brought in George Springer, Carlos Correa. They started hitting on their first-round picks, Alex Bregman. And although we know what happened with them, I mean, they've made themselves a pretty solid contender. So a tip of the hat to the Astros organization. But
and then they cheated.
Yeah, they did. But anyway, I see similarities between those two teams. but they do remind you a little bit of the 2015 Cubs as well. And Jonah, we do know that you have to leave so we appreciate you joining us for baseball. Jonah, have a wonderful evening, and we'll be bringing up NBA basketball coming up.
Thank you guys for having me for baseball. It's always a pleasure. Hope to be back next week with you guys talking sports.
And the envelopes were in the Bulls' favor as they landed a top 4 pick. They'll be picking 4th in the 2020 NBA draft. And as a Bulls fan, I was stoked. We were sitting there waiting on the envelopes to go through, and each one that pulled out a different team, it started getting closer and closer. And then once they landed in the top 4, I was ecstatic. I just couldn't wait after the break to see what was going on. But the Bulls landed top 4 picks. Swig, what do you think?
It's a huge boon for the franchise. Absolutely. They definitely have a lot more flexibility now what they want to do. And I think this is a huge opportunity for that new Bulls regime with Karnisovas and whoever the Bulls end up bringing in to be the new coach and the rest of that staff to really make an imprint on the roster. We know that Jim Boylan did not exactly leave a great impression on most, if not all, of the players and staff members in the organization. So the Bulls had an opportunity before to really wipe themselves clean of that, and now they have a better than expected opportunity to bring in an impact player for next year's team. I still think that they need to go best player available. The Bulls are more than 1 year away from being a contender, and we'll see who actually ends up falling to number 4. I think trades with Minnesota and Golden State, I think both of them are at least possible to trade out of where they are, which could impact the boards. So it remains to be seen who will actually fall to number 4 for the Bulls, but this is an unexpected opportunity for them, and they'll have a lot of options to address coming up in October when the draft starts.
Yeah, Arturas Karnisovas definitely got himself into a wonderful situation early on in his Bulls tenure. And we don't know who the coach is going to be. Neither do we know for the Nets. I'm going to bring up a crazy thought about the Nets head coach. But the Bulls don't have a head coach right now, and it's going to be weird. They're going to have to land one before the draft, I would assume. And there's a lot of options out there at that spot, and it's going to be really cool to see Karnisovas really try to transform that organization. I honestly, at that spot, I love Obi Toppin. I think he fits into that little that lineup really well with how they're going to build things in Chicago. You put him there, he's sort of raw, I think, so he wouldn't work in like a situation like Golden State where they're trying to win now, not like they're going to draft a small forward. But I think he's sort of raw, similar to a Jimmy Butler that they developed, and I think he fits well. You could go Kobe White, you can go Levine, Toppin, Markkanen, and then you got Carter, and then you got guys like Otto Porter and Chris Dunn, Satoransky, and multiple other guys coming off the bench. Thaddeus Young's another. And I do think one thing they need to upgrade is a backup center, because you can't have Luke Cornett and Cristiano Felicio come off the bench and be your backup center. So especially with Wendell Carter's injury history, I expect Karnisovas to make a move to just bring in more depth at the center position.
I could absolutely see it. And Karnisovas' track record with his drafting, especially the last couple of years with the Nuggets, landing guys like Michael Porter Jr. and Bol in the mid-lottery for Porter and the second round for Bol, getting great value out of these picks in addition to production. There is more pressure on him to hit with this 4th pick, even though it is overall a weaker draft. The thing with Toppin is, as much as I like him, I think he is going to slide a little bit, even though I don't think he should, because he is older than the rest of the prospects in this class. He's 22, and while that's not old, that's about 3 years older than most of the guys who are going to be drafted in the lottery. So that is somebody who needs to have a little bit more polish than he does. We know how good he can run the floor. He's outstanding on the offensive end of the court in a lot of ways, but his pick and roll recognition defensively is probably the worst I've seen since Andrea Bargnani was on the Knicks. And it needs a lot of improvement. While he was college basketball's best player this season, I'd say, and I do think he's deserving of a top 10 pick. I would be a little bit surprised if the Bulls end up taking him at number 4. And by the way, we can't be disrespecting former Knick Luke Cornett like that. Everyone's favorite.
Yeah, Luke Cornett.
But I do think the Bulls need to address that position. But I think a backup center, if that's what they're looking for, they can get that on the free agent market. They don't need to spend the 4th overall pick on it.
Yeah, that's what I was going towards, was a backup center because via free agency. Because if you're taking a center at the number 4 pick to be a backup, then you're not taking best available, because chances are James Wiseman's off the board and he's the only center capable of going in the top 4. But would you, if you were Karnisovas, or do you think that he would make a splash and try to go up and trade one of these picks, or do you think that he holds on to the future trying to build it up, to trade up to maybe Golden State or something like that?
I think the temptation is going to be there for him to try to make a big splash, but ultimately I think he's smart enough to trust his track record, trust his instincts, and get who he thinks the best value is at number 4. He's proven multiple times that he's capable of finding a diamond in the rough a little bit later. He has the opportunity to take that player much earlier this year, but I think he would be a little bit wiser to either stay where he is and draft the best available player, which is what the Bulls need, or even, if possible, trade back and accumulate an extra asset or two so he's more likely to hit on one of these projects in the late lottery. This is not a strong draft class overall, so I think it's a little bit more likely that they can hit on somebody in the 12 or 15 or 18 range, similar to the 2013 draft with Giannis going 15th to the Bucks, taking a bit of a gamble that could have a huge reward. So I think he would be a little bit wiser to do that.
Yeah, and Chris Dunn. Chris Dunn, I don't think he's a capable starting point guard in the league. We already mentioned Kobe White's ball handling skills and being able to facilitate as a point guard. He's definitely more of a combo guard. He shoots it well, and he's not the best when it comes to that. How much do you think that goes into coaching, or do you think that that is more based on his play style and they should bring in someone that is capable, maybe with that number 4 pick if a LaMelo Ball is there?
Overall, I think it is more play style. In general, in sports today compared to a couple decades ago, we've seen this across different sporting landscapes where before teams would try to force the player into their mold. Now we're seeing players in general, there are obviously exceptions, but there are players that they are given a lot more freedom in general to play, maximize their own abilities rather than to try to force them to be something they're not. And we've seen that throughout, take football with system quarterbacks, a guy like Robert Griffin III, when he came in with the Redskins, for example, or the Washington football team. I apologize. But when he came in with Washington, when he was drafted, if he was drafted to a similar situation back in the 80s or the 90s, they would have tried to force a square peg into a round hole. We're seeing a similar philosophy in basketball with not forcing players to stick to a certain position. We're seeing a more positionless game. So I do think that whoever the Bulls end up taking, they'll try to maximize their abilities rather than force them to play a certain style of basketball.
Tomas Satoransky, another one, Otto Porter, they all have big contracts. Do you think that the Bulls should maybe go out and try to get someone to, like, a big contract guy? Or do you think that with their cap space right now, maybe they should just ride out that Otto Porter contract, although it was horrible, and I don't know why they made the trade at the time to bring him in. I mean, they weren't going to make the playoffs, but then again, you don't know what you're getting into with that. So you got a bad contract there. Do you think that they might make a splash via free agency, or is that more with the number 4 overall pick and filling needs?
I think that they're more likely to make the splash with the 4th pick or wherever they end up taking in the first round. I think they would be wise to make a splash in terms of taking on a bad contract from another team with that cap space in return for, they'll get a first round pick to do that, or another young and attractive asset. That is what smart rebuilding teams do. I think the Knicks should follow a similar path, and I know we'll get into that more in a few minutes, but I think the Bulls would be very wise to go on and take another contract that a team is looking to unload if it only has 1 year on it, because they can get a first round pick to do that. And that is a very smart and efficient way to rebuild the team.
Yeah, and the spot for the Bulls, who do you think comes in and does the job for the coaching spot for them? I think Kenny Atkinson's a great fit for them. What do you think? Kenny Atkinson, or maybe another long shot of head coach? Who do you think?
I actually think Atkinson is going to end up either with that job or one of the other vacancies, maybe Philadelphia, who just fired Brett Brown earlier today. I was surprised when the Nets let him go. Yeah, I know it's kind of come to light a little bit that he didn't get along with the Stars all that well, and I know that we'll touch on that. But Atkinson was a huge part in changing the culture of the Nets, who had an extremely toxic environment there in the early 2010s after that disastrous trade with the Celtics. So Atkinson definitely deserves some credit for that turnaround and bringing the Nets back to be a respectable team. I wouldn't be surprised for the Bulls to go after somebody like him who's still pretty young and adaptable and does not have any established stars on that roster. So it might be a good fit for him, coaching wise, with a team that doesn't have too many big egos on it yet.
For sure. You look across the Bulls, if he has issues with the Stars, he ain't got any issues there because there's no stars on the Bulls. But anyway, we're going to transition over to the Knicks, talking about not having any stars. They got unlucky yet again. They'll be picking later on. They're still a top 10 pick, but not a good look for the Knicks yet again. They got lucky with the Rangers, not so much with the Knicks.
Well, I do like hockey more, so I guess I'll take that trade. But I called eighth on the last episode. Is anyone really surprised the Knicks fell in the lottery again? I don't think there's been a more predictable event since Jeffrey Epstein died. It's just so obvious that we're going to fall in the lottery at this point, okay? I honestly didn't have any real hope at this point. The Knicks have crushed whatever hopes I've had as a fan ever since I was born. So, fine. The Knicks do have a second first-round pick this year that we got from the Clippers and the Marcus Morris trade. We do have an early second round pick as well. I believe it's number 38 overall. So the Knicks do have more assets than usual in the draft. We did get 2 first rounders back from Dallas as well. I believe they are 2021 and 2023. So we do have more first round picks than we usually do. I still think the Knicks, especially in this weaker draft, similar logic to the Bulls, should try to accumulate assets and trade back. Maybe get another first-round pick. But I think they're more likely to be impatient and make a big splash with Minnesota or Golden State to try to get Ball. I honestly don't see Edwards being the pick because the Knicks really have been looking for a scoring first point guard for basically 2 decades. So I think they're more likely to go after somebody like Ball, even though his strengths are more as a passer and a facilitator. But it's similar logic to the White Sox with Hahn. The Knicks need to rebuild, and I think it would be wise of them to take on bad contracts to get more first-round picks. But I think they're more likely to follow this rebuilding plan for another 3 to 4 minutes and then be impatient and make a trade for that would mortgage whatever future we might have for a quicker fix that might get us into the playoffs but not make us actual contenders. So, falling in the lottery, not a surprise. I don't think anyone's going to be surprised by that given our track record and our reputation, which is well earned. But we do still have a decent amount of flexibility and a couple extra picks this year. I hope the Knicks are smart with it, but they need to prove me wrong for me to believe that.
Yeah. And the Knicks, they're definitely a very interesting organization. Throughout the past couple of years, you've seen a lot of change go through that organization. They're the only one of these basketball teams that we're covering that has a head coach hired. As we mentioned,
Yeah,
Tom Thibodeau, the old Bulls coach, a big defensive first guy, and maybe they go with the defensive guy up at the top of the board. Highly unlikely. They need some guys to score the basketball. Would it be a reach to go get Cole Anthony out of North Carolina? Do you think he fits the Knicks scheme there?
I could see it. I think the Knicks are going to target somebody like him, maybe like Tyrese Halliburton if he is still there, or Killian Hayes from France, who's basically the anti-Ntilikina, who we took in a similar position, who was also 8th overall in 2017. But Ntilikina's strengths are on the defensive end. Killian Hayes is a shot-making point guard instead, who might be able to push Ntilikina over to the 2. So I do think there's a lot of options at point guard at number 8, or if we traded down to, say, number 12 or number 14 at the end of the lottery, a Cole Anthony would probably still be there, or a Tyrese Maxey would probably still be there. So there's a lot of point guard options. If we do stick at number 8, or even if we trade back, we could also choose from a variety of wing players. After RJ Barrett, who showed some flashes, we have Kevin Knox, who's been underwhelming, let's say, in 2 years. I'm not giving up on him yet. He's still way too young for that. And I want to practice what I preach here with the Knicks being patient since they're not ready to be a contender yet. But even if Knox does start to pan out a little bit, we don't really have any more depth behind that outside of a guy like Wayne Ellington or Reggie Bullock, who's only going to be around for the rest of this season, maybe next season anyway. So outside of center with Mitchell Robinson, where I think the Knicks should probably avoid using their lottery pick on a center, the possibilities are very extreme for them in terms of a guard, a wing, or even a guy like Obi Toppin at power forward if he falls.
Yeah, and the similar narrative to the Bulls with that Toppin pick is he's a very raw talent. He's had a great season with Dayton, arguably the best player in college basketball. And he's a guy that the Knicks aren't trying to win right now, neither are the Bulls. So he'd be a great fit for a team like that isn't necessarily a contender, but will be really good at developing.
Well, I do like the idea of Toppin fitting next to Mitchell Robinson as a four. I think those two could really complement each other's strengths. We know how good Robinson is on the defensive end. As a shot blocker, he can kind of make up for some of Toppin's deficiencies defending the pick and roll and as a rebounder. But overall, I think the Knicks have a lot of holes here. I think they do need to go for best player available. But the Knicks, you mentioned the Knicks aren't trying to win right now. Sadly, I think they are, and they're just failing spectacularly at it. We've seen them make several short-sighted trades over the years, and I might get into some of them here in a minute. But they need to be more patient because unless we get a star or two to sign as a free agent, we've tried that path several times. The Knicks' best chance is to luck out in the lottery and develop a good player in the draft or two. The Nets managed to do it with guys like Karis LeVert and Rondae Hollis-Jefferson that slowly brought them back to respectability. And then, they got a solid coach to change the culture. The Knicks have an established coach. We'll see how he fits with the team, but we do not have those proven solid players locked up outside of maybe Julius Randle, who's got one more guaranteed year on his contract. So they need to be smarter and look towards the future. But in general, we've seen the Knicks blow up everything to make a short-sighted trade several times. And the same owner is in charge. We've been through this before in terms of changing front office executives and coaches. And the story is always the same. So while the guys that we've brought in have said and done all the right things so far, we know how quickly that could change. So we'll see what ends up happening in October when the draft actually happens. But right now, I think the Knicks are more likely to either try to make a splash by moving up or stay put at number 8 rather than look to the future and trade back.
Makes a lot of sense for them to look towards the future with what they have in place. But like you mentioned, they signed Marcus Morris in the offseason, who they ended up dealing at the deadline, and they got a first-round pick out of it. So essentially that signing helped them build for the future, and it tried to help them win now, in which they couldn't do.
Well, Morris, I do think, was the exception. I think the intention was to try to have him come in and, the misguided image was to try to have him lead us to the playoffs. But the Knicks actually, overall, I think did a pretty good job with him. Turning him into a first-round pick, even though it is late in the round, is still a decent way to use an asset. Unfortunately, that's the exception and not the rule over the years. And I know I've talked about the Knicks. They should take on a bad contract. We have more flexibility to do that than almost any other team, because Julius Randle is the only one taking up significant salary for next season. The veteran placeholders that we signed for this year, Elfrid Payton, Wayne Ellington, Reggie Bullock, Taj Gibson, all of them have team options for next year. So if we were to decline all of those, we'd have a lot of cap space, because after Julius Randle, our second most expensive player is sadly still Joakim Noah, who we're paying for a couple more years. But even with that horrible decision haunting us, we would still have the flexibility to take on a bad contract, similar to how, say, Chandler Parsons' contract bounced around the league for a couple of years. We could make a similar investment and take on an extra first-round pick or two in return, and then we might have the assets, if we actually show some improvement, to use that to go for an established star who might be disgruntled, maybe a Donovan Mitchell with Utah after the whole Gobert fiasco. So I think the Knicks could do something like that in a year or two in an attempt attempt to, we all know the rumors to Giannis, who's going to be a free agent in 2021. I don't buy any of it, but the Knicks are stupid, and they could do something like that to try to entice somebody like him to come. So the Knicks do have a decent amount of flexibility. What remains to be seen is if they have any patience or smarts.
And one more question before we get to the Nets. And on the Knicks, do you think, well, you mentioned the financial capability of bringing on a bad contract. Why not go after and try to get a good contract? You think they go out and overpay for a free agent and try to bring him in to help win now?
I could see us doing that for a guy like Fred VanVleet if we decide to go a different route in the draft. If we take a wing, I could see us going for somebody like that, a good but not great player as a free agent. I honestly don't think that would be a good idea, though, because giving A-plus money to a B-plus free agent would limit our flexibility for a true superstar going forward. So I don't think it's a horrible idea if it's somebody that could really change the culture of the team. But the free agent market this year is going to be pretty weak overall, and I don't think it would be super wise to spend too much on one player or to give too many contracts to middling veterans like we did last year with the guys I just mentioned. So overall, I think the Knicks should try to accumulate the bad contracts to get those first-round picks and then fill the rest of the roster with young players.
Shifting gears over to the Nets, they got eliminated in the playoffs, broke out the brooms and got swept. And that's not a good look for the Brooklyn Nets. But there are some questions going in the offseason that are a lot more optimistic than this year. There's some things on their checklist that include re-signing Joe Harris or deciding what to do with him. They have a head coach vacancy. We did mention Jacques Vaughn doing a fantastic job leading them to a 7-3 record during the regular season and then going into the playoffs, in which he did look pretty good in the restart for the games that didn't count. And then when they did count, they got destroyed. But then again, it was Toronto. But he did beat some good teams in there. Head coach is a nice open position for them. And here we go. I'm going to bring something up right now. I believe Greg Popovich will be packing his bags from San Antonio and going to Brooklyn. And I believe Tim Duncan will become the head coach of the San Antonio Spurs. A little bold, but they have a head coach vacancy. And I think it gets filled by one of the greatest, if not the greatest, head coach in NBA history.
That would be a very exciting pickup for the Nets if it does happen. I do think that Tim Duncan will be the coach of the Spurs long term. I think he is the clear successor to Popovich, but I would be surprised to see Popovich just up and leave after. I know that this was the Spurs' worst season in 25 years, and their fans must be crying right now. But considering all the loyalty that the Spurs organization, which has run so well, has shown Popovich, I'd be surprised if he just up and leaves after one more difficult, horrible season by their standards. I do understand the appeal of having a healthy Irving and Durant, hopefully for them, for him to coach. It would definitely be a bit of an easier situation to step into than a rebuilding team like the Bulls or the Knicks. That the Nets are a more appealing spot at the moment. I would be pretty surprised if Popovich were to just leave the Spurs after all this time, though. But of course, the Nets would be interested.
Yeah, they do have an opening position. They fired Kenny Atkinson, who we mentioned might be a good fit for the Bulls. He didn't gel well with the Stars in Brooklyn. And speaking of Stars, there's a lot of talent on that team. And usually you look across the league, and when they build great championship teams, there's a big three. And right now they have Kyrie and KD. Do you think that they add a third?
I still hold out hope that Karis LeVert can be that third player. I think he would be a great fit as a complementary scorer on that team because we know what he's capable of. And if he gets more open looks with defenses surrounding or focusing on a healthy Kyrie and Kevin Durant, which is obviously a huge question mark, especially with Durant coming off the torn Achilles. But at least figuratively, it would be smart for the Nets to try to build around that concept of a healthy Irving and Durant who would take up the majority of the defense's attention. And then they have a solid supporting cast there. We'll see if they bring Joe Harris back. But if they have him and Karis LeVert and Luwawa Shabaro, who was kind of the bright spot for the Nets in their series sweep, they have some shooters who can knock down open looks from the outside. And that's what they need to complement the guys like Irving and Durant, who are more ball dominant, and then a guy like Jared Allen or DeAndre Jordan inside, who's more there for rebounding and defense. So that team as a concept could really, really gel. And if they get the right coach in there, they could be contenders very, very quickly. But I still think Jacques Vaughn did an outstanding job. And I don't think it would be wise for the Nets to just kick him to the curb so quickly.
Yeah, he could end up getting the interim tag removed and becoming the head coach full-time of the Brooklyn Nets. And you mentioned Jared Allen, and I was curious, do you think that they will extend Jared Allen in the offseason, or do you think that that's something that maybe they'll just have to wait and see about?
That's a tough one. I know in an ideal world, the Nets would obviously love to extend Jared Allen. He's 22 years old. He's one of the better defensive centers in the league already, and he can definitely rebound. But since the Nets made that commitment to DeAndre Jordan, who's essentially an older version of Jared Allen at this point in his career, they have very similar playing styles. I don't mean that as an insult to either one of them, but Jared Allen willingly took a bench role, and Irving and Durant willingly took less money so Jordan could get the $10 million a year on that contract. It makes it difficult in today's, with the salary cap, and especially with the expected increased salary going out the window with everything going on and all the financial ramifications of the pandemic on the NBA financially. I think it might force the Nets to make a trade. I know they don't want to, and they wouldn't have much leverage in those talks, but DeAndre Jordan's not going anywhere so quickly. That would just piss off Irving and Durant. So it's just counterproductive. We talked about Atkinson. His downfall was not connecting with the stars. So I don't think they want to get rid of Jared Allen, but they could at least get something for him and avoid some of the financial ramifications coming up.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense for them to try to feel out that situation. Like you mentioned, the two centers, I still think depth at the center position is not a bad thing to have in the NBA because they're so big and some of them are injury prone. And it's a great position to have depth at because there's not a lot of people. Like you can find good guards maybe in the G League to come up and fill in, but a center, I mean, that's a position that you need to know how to, you need to know how to rebound, get box outs, and just play great defense. And they got two of those guys. So as a contender, I don't know if they would trade him, but it would make sense for the future for them to go ahead and move on from him if they're committed to Jordan. But to have a duo like that could be very nice. Hopefully Allen doesn't get too upset about the bench role or vice versa.
Well, if he's serious about being a contending team, and I'm not saying any of this to criticize Jared Allen, I think he handled the situation outstanding. It was an exceptional and very mature way for a young player to handle something like that after he was really blossoming in his first year or two in the league coming out of Texas. But it's, of course, it would be great in an ideal world for the Nets to have both of them going forward, but that's just not realistic. And in today's game, where even the bigs have to be having range, you have to have stretch fours and stretch fives more than ever. Neither of them would qualify in that regard, and it might not make sense long term, or it just might not be possible to have two carbon copies of each other who do almost the exact same things on the court, taking up two roster spots rather than one. They don't add different skills to the table. And while long term it would be smarter for the Nets to keep Allen, I don't see how realistic that is, because finding a taker for Jordan's contract, while it's not terrible, would be difficult. And since they have so little leverage, it might force them to give up an asset or two that they would otherwise keep. Allen, since he's so young, could actually get more from the team that trades for him. So I'm not saying that the Nets should trade him, and I'm not saying that having depth at center is a bad thing. It would obviously be great. It's just not realistic in the salary cap world of the NBA.
And going back to the head coaching vacancy, you mentioned Jacques Vaughn maybe being their head coach. Who do you like to coach the Brooklyn Nets next year?
I honestly do like Vaughn a lot. If he can prove himself with the stars, with the star players of Irving and Durant, I would honestly like the opportunity to keep him. I don't think it would be wise for the Nets to give up on Vaughn after he had such a promising start. It seems like he has grown from his mistakes with the Orlando Magic, which I don't think were all his fault, considering the let's say, feckless roster that was in Orlando at the time in the mid to early to mid 2010s after Vince Carter was gone, and they were stuck with some guys like Hito Turkoglu after the steroid suspension. So, but overall, we've seen that Vaughn can motivate and get a lot out of his players. He can really maximize their ability. He has the support of guys like Doc Rivers around the NBA already. That's not nothing. So I don't think it would be wise for the Nets to say, well, hey, you did a nice job for 3 weeks. Now scram. I don't think that would send the right message either. I think that, like, if the Nets aren't going to keep them, they really need to be sold on an established guy. So if they can get Popovich, if he is actually interested, then yeah, I understand letting Vaughn go for somebody like that. But if they're going to disregard him and discard him for a guy who's similarly young and unproven, I don't think that would send the right message.
Yeah, you mentioned Jacques Vaughn being a head coach and being able to gel with those veteran players. It was great to have the support of Jamal Crawford, who was actually on that roster this year. And he basically said he was a great head coach and he did a great job. And I mean, you look at what he did, and he did do a pretty solid job up until the round against the Toronto Raptors. And to get that support from a veteran guy like Crawford, hopefully it's contagious and it goes on to those big stars if they bring him in as the head coach fully.
Crawford's support is invaluable. There's no question about it. But his support alone is not enough. And he hasn't been with the organization for very long. I think Crawford being on a roster was long overdue, but that's kind of besides the point here. Crawford is a well-respected veteran player, but the only reason he ended up with the Nets at the end of the season is because they had several guys either get injured or opt out of the restarts. So while I don't think that that's a bad thing, obviously, you'll never turn down a cosign from a respected veteran player. His support alone is not enough. So I still think that he needs more of a vote of confidence. I'm not entirely sure what the ownership's perception of him is. And I know that his handling of the regular season games in the bubble was admirable. It was more than that. It was just fantastic. But the playoff series wasn't great. I'm not here to pin that on him. The Raptors were much healthier and a more well-rounded team, obviously. So I don't think, pinning the loss on him or using that as the excuse to get him out of town is wise. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Nets were looking for a shinier new toy to bring in as the coach, that they would use the lack of success in the playoffs this year as that reasoning to bring in a more established presence or established name.
It fits that sort of cushion on the morale if you were to fire him that way by saying, you did a great job, but we didn't like your success, so get out of town. But
right.
Do you think that they draft 2 players, or do you think that they maybe make a trade and try to get 3 players by trading into the first, or do you think they move some picks?
I think they're going to make some sort of move. I think the Nets are in more of a position to be aggressive in terms of upgrading the roster than the Bulls or the Knicks would be in the short term. The Nets don't have the same long-term flexibility that a team that sucks has. I guess that's one of the few advantages. But the Nets, they have established their window by signing these bigger stars, and the stars usually sign a contract where they can opt out after the 3rd season. And while everything remains to be seen with how Durant comes back or if Irving can stay on the court for more than 14 games at a time for once, the Nets don't have a super long window with those players, whether they succeed or not. So if the Nets are not sold on a guy like Karis LeVert being the 3rd player for a big 3, for example, they need to go out and get somebody, and quick. Would they be able to attract an Anthony Davis after next season? Maybe. But are they going to get impatient and trade for somebody like Donovan Mitchell right now? I would not be surprised. And they do have the assets to pull something like that off. So they need to be more aggressive in the short term, only because they've already defined how long their championship window is going to be.
Yeah, I like that a lot. That was great insight. Who do you think that they will bring in if they were to make a move like that?
In terms of a player?
Yeah.
That's a tough one because financially they can only bring in so many guys and they'd have to move some salaries around. And for them to bring in an established star, they would have to get rid of some solid role players or solid complementary pieces like Levert or like Joe Harris if they re-sign him to make the salaries work. So I wouldn't know right off the top of my head who they might go for outside of a guy like Mitchell who's still on a rookie contract. It would be difficult to bring in an established star who's already on a bigger contract without getting rid of a guy like DeAndre Jordan in return, because he's really the only one outside of Irving and Durant who could make the salaries work. So thinking ahead a little bit, the first type of thought that would come to my mind is a veteran player on a bad team. So like similar logic to when Thaddeus Young started bouncing around the league. That type of player that they haven't really addressed, who makes somewhere in the 12 to 15 million range, but is a better player than that. So it's really hard to think of somebody right off the top of my head. I wouldn't be surprised if Aaron Gordon forces his way out of Orlando. I could see Brooklyn trying to make a move for somebody like that. But this is all speculation, and I don't know how that would work in terms of the salary cap. I could also see Buddy Hield being a possibility with Sacramento because while his contract, I believe, is for 110, and it's, I think, 22 or 23 million a year, there is enough flexibility to make that work, and him being benched is going to leave a bad taste in his mouth in Sacramento. So I could see somebody like him forcing his way onto the market and the Nets being aggressive, but I'm not trying to make a definitive statement yet.
And one more thing before we decide to wrap up this episode. Do you think the Bulls and the Nets would make a trade with each other?
I don't see why not. Yeah, if they can find a match, if the Nets were interested in Zach LaVine, for example, and the Bulls would be able to take on a DeAndre Jordan type of contract, yes, I do think it is possible, but it's very, very dependent on what those teams' front offices have in mind. We think it would be smarter for the Bulls to take on those contracts and look to the future, and I think they are smart enough to do that, but that is still a big question mark with a new front office. And the Nets, we know that they're historically more aggressive and they're in position to make a short-term push, but we don't know if that's actually what they're going to do. So I do think on paper there is some absolute possibility there to have a trade made between them, but there's only a limited option or two in terms of matching up the salaries and to fit both of their needs, short-term for the Nets, long-term for the Bulls.
And would a guy like Lauri Markkanen fit in, or is that just insane?
I wouldn't be surprised if the Bulls end up cutting the cord on him a little bit quicker than expected because of his durability issues and because they're relatively stronger at that position than they are at the rest of the roster. If they are not 100% committed to Lauri Markkanen, trading him for a long-term asset is the best move, or a couple of long-term assets is the best move, but I think his market would be very limited. He's basically a less explosive or dynamic version of Porzingis, he kind of reminds me of that skill set wise, but Porzingis has done a pretty good job coming off of the torn ACL for Dallas. Markkanen's had several similar injuries, and I don't think he's proven quite that much yet. So I don't think there would be a lot of teams lining up to trade for him, and I don't know if Brooklyn would see him as the win now piece that they're looking for.
Yeah, he's not someone that you bring in if you want to win, but he could be a nice, capable shooter. But that probably
I don't think that would fit Brooklyn's timeline, man.
Exactly. Well, that's all that we have for today. So I appreciate you guys giving us another listen. And be sure to click that subscribe button and also click the like button. And next week we're going to be having another episode, and then the week after that's our big football one. We're going to be going down, breaking. We haven't talked a lot of football on this show yet, but we're going to be breaking down the Chicago Bears, New York Giants, New York Jets. We're going to be diving all into it, and I can't wait. It's going to be really fun, leading us right up into week 1, so it'll be awesome. Thank you guys for the listen, and we'll see you later.